Si te interesa la economía, pero también el contexto, el análisis pausado y la mirada a largo plazo, te invitamos a entrar en nuestro Economics Café. Un espacio para reflexionar sobre tendencias económicas de la mano de los expertos del Servicio de Estudios de Mapfre. ¿Te tomas un café con nosotros?
Hello and welcome back to Economics Café, a podcast by Mapfre Economics where we explore the forces shaping the global economy and the insurance sector. Today we're talking about the silver economy, a term that is no longer in the future but in the present of our labour markets. And to dive into today's topic, we're joined by Dan Pontefract. Welcome, Dan. He's the author of The Future of Work is Grey. And Ricardo González, he's the chief economist at Mapfre Economics. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Dan, first of all, what inspired you to write the book and what's about?
Well, I received an email when I turned 50 from one of my speaker bureaus, and it said, we are refreshing the roster, and we're no longer going to need you anymore. And here I was, a former executive in human resources for 20 years, and I realized I had never thought about age as an executive in human resources. So having been fired from a speakers bureau got me thinking about age. And so I spent 3 years researching the problems and the opportunities for age in the workforce.
That's really, really interesting. Actually, in your book, you described that we're actually in a demographic tidal wave. So what exactly is happening in the labor markets and why should companies start paying attention to it?
Yeah, it's a hidden issue that no one is really paying attention to except demographers. And so what's happening, and it's been slowly happening since the 1970s, women sort of have begun having fewer babies. It's called the fertility rate. And so what's known as the fertility rate replacement level is called 2.1 babies per woman, just to keep Spain's population, Canada's population at the same levels. But it has been dramatically going down since the 1970s. So for example, in my country where I live in Canada, that number is 1.26. So that means 1.26 babies are being had by every woman, which obviously over time you'll see there's going to be less people in the population. So from a workplace perspective, what we're not paying attention to is actually that. There will be fewer workers. And also, as we age, i.e. there'll be less and fewer workers working, from a young age perspective, we obviously have more middle-aged and older workers. So the entire culture of our organizations are in need of change. And if organizations aren't paying attention to this, then they're going to be run over by a change they don't want.
That's actually really interesting. And Ricardo, both Agenomics, an initiative by Fundación Mapfre, and Mapfre Economics have been studying this trend for years at this point. So what are the key findings about the role of senior workers in the economy?
Agenomics' main conclusion is that you cannot treat senior workers as an economy partner, because they are now in Spain are around 1/3 of the population, but they represent 39% of total private consumption, and they represent 40% of total households' finance resources. So many people is depending on them. And another conclusion is that there is some kind of edadism, because whenever a senior worker gets unemployed, it's very difficult for them to go back to the labor market.
Yeah, actually, we see edadism pretty much in our everyday life. And what you also said about the economic impact of the seniors in the economy is actually huge. And we, here in Spain, we really saw that in the crisis, right? So, so actually, from a macro perspective, what risks do we face, like, if economists doesn't really adapt to this shift we live in?
Okay, I think here we have to talk about the labor force, and the trends. The labor force is shrinking, and the trend is that they're going to sink much more. So first, we have to reconsider what is labor force, because nowadays, for us, labor force is people between 20 and 64 years old. However, that is not going to be economically viable, because the budgets of the states are going to increase very much, because healthcare expenses increases very much with age, pensions, also public pensions. So there is a risk of an economy shrinking, first decreasing, but after that shrinking, with high levels of public debt, which could even lead to financial stability problems. So the problem is huge.
Yeah, you're completely right. And then you actually argue that many organizations, as we said, nobody's paying attention to that. It's the demographers and people that really study economy, etc. Right? So you argue that many organizations are not really prepared for this shift, and they are still organized for younger societies. So what do you think they are the biggest mismatches between today's workforce reality and how companies are structured?
Where to start, Marta? Well, first of all, from a culture perspective, when you think about talent, how do you bring talent in? So Ricardo mentioned, we have to change the way in which we're thinking about the dynamics of a workforce. How do you bring talent in? Is there some way in which maybe we should be rethinking bringing in talent that are in their 50s, 60s, or 70s? Maybe that could be the transferable skills of a worker who worked somewhere else in another organization, and indeed. But then you look at, hey, we don't just have to bring in young people, we could bring in older workers, and that experience, that transferable skills that they've learned somewhere else could be used in our organization. So for example, an engineer who might have spent 30 years being an engineer in one organization, maybe that new organization could look at the engineer and what are the skills that they could bring to their company, not necessarily being an engineer, just the work experience. So we have to rethink what I call the career ladder. So the career ladder has to become something I call the canvas. So we have to think about multi-directional careers, multi-directional options inside the culture of the organization. If we just think people go up with their career and then they retire, in this new world where there is a demographic disruption, where economic change is absolutely happening, organizational culture has to change, and we think about careers as one of the ways in which to start that.
So actually, Mapfre could be a great example of that, because we do have senior professionals from, they have worked in other departments, like in the technology department, or we used to have an editorial, so some that used to work there, and it's a mix, and that really makes retail day-to-day basis. So how should enterprises work this out with, there are usually some intergenerational, not problems, but issues, like how do we manage to have so many different people working for the same things, with the same goal?
Well, one of the things we can think about inside the organization like a Mapfre is rotations or gigs or stints or short projects where you have multi-generational teams working, so that every company has new initiatives. So someone comes up with a great idea. Okay, how do you staff that idea? And if you staff that idea with typically thinking, oh, you know what, we're just going to have young people take this on, or people from one department, we need to be thinking cross-sectional, cross-generational, multi-generational. And so composition of teams, composition of ideas, composition of projects is actually going to be one of the most fundamental, more high-performing and productive outputs and outcomes that you can be thinking about, rather than, oh, we're just going to give the young people this job or the older people this job. We need to really think about multi-generational thinking.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see, definitely, because we have so much to do still in that regard. So, Ricardo, back to you. And what about the insurance sector? Because I could imagine that it could be one of the most impacted sector in this shift.
Insurance sector, I think we have to split two problems. No, the first one is aging population. And the second one is shrinking population, and it's different. No, aging population for the insurance sector is not bad. It's even good because we cover a lot of line of businesses, and for example, health insurance could be a good complement to the public insurance health sector. No? However, another important issue is savings. No, savings are going to be needed to complement the public pensions, and there we have a lot of to offer. No, both in the accumulation phase and in the decumulation phase, which is very important, and we have a lot of new products that we can issue. So aging is not bad. We have in many countries 1-2 decades ahead that the population is increasing, is not decreasing, but shrinking population is not really good because autos, homes also decrease, and in that case we have to consider another important indicator for us, which is GDP per capita. If you focus in markets that the trend in GDP per capita is up, that could offset the decreasing population because you have more cars per capita, the owners can live alone, and you know, so but it's very challenging in the future.
Well, definitely, yeah. Dan,
Yeah.
if you could give one piece of advice to a CEO that is actually facing this demographic shift, what could it be?
Ask yourself, are we an age-inclusive culture? So if I'm a CEO or anyone sitting around the C-suite, actually, I'm asking that question of them. What does age-inclusive mean? So do we have ageist training for our managers and leaders? Do we know what ageism is? What's our hiring and firing practices? Are we terminating people because of an age, i.e. they're too old or they make too much money? That's an ageist practice. Other culture issues, how do we promote people? Who gets what assignments? Who gets what projects? All of these are age-related. And then obviously and ultimately, I would argue that every CEO should be doing an age audit. They really need to know what the age is of their organization. And many organizations have no clue what their average age is or what their range of age is. And if so, you don't know what you're playing with from an age perspective. How do you know how far people are away from either retiring or what your composition is inside the org? And again, back to high-performing teams, when you have a multi-generational workforce doing good things, then you have a higher output as well. So I think ultimately it's about culture, but it is about, are you age-inclusive and what are you doing on the age file as a CEO?
Well, sure. And Ricardo, what about policymakers? What could you say to them? Because our administration and other institutions are not prepared.
They are not. I will say them that they have to be brave, no? Because full retirement is not going to be possible, no? Many people have to prolong their careers, and it's very controversial. It's very controversial. We can see what happens in France whenever someone says that they want to prolong the retirement age, no? And it's social unrest and so on and so forth, but it's a need. And yesterday it was announced that Germany is going to prolong the retirement age to 71. It's a proposal. Okay, in Europe, the longest retirement age now is in the UK, 68 years. But and also the German proposal, I think is very good. Want to have some kind of fund, a private fund with mandatory contributions of the younger people. To complement, to reinforce the second and the third pillar of the pension system. So I think it's well done, but it's always very, very controversial.
It definitely is.
Definitely.
Yeah, and as we have a little time, I wanted also to ask you, Dan, about one little mention you do about menopause in the book. I really found that really interesting, because I think it's the first time, or one of the first time, that I see that written. Like lots of women are stopping working before they should, just because they don't feel understood, and that could really cause a problem. So could you tell us a little bit more about that?
90% of organizations are led by a male CEO. And I believe it's incumbent upon male CEOs to take a look at their workforce, which is typically comprised of 55% women, and on average. And ergo, there are certain health-related issues that women suffer that men do not. One of those is menopause. And I think a man can understand pregnancy and parental leave and maternal leave, and how that can thwart a woman's progression in her career. But so can menopause, premenopause, perimenopause, postmenopause. And these are fundamental issues that middle-aged and older women suffer from. In fact, 67% of women suffer from some form of menopause condition. So why is it that we, as most men are running these organizations, can't take a look at that fact and make accommodations, make awareness first and foremost, but make
because
accommodations?
we do that with the postpartum, right? Like the maternity rooms, we adapt for that, but we definitely do not adapt for menopause.
No, and these are very physiological changes and pieces to their health that ultimately women have to go through, and it's normal. So if we can normalize it, but then make accommodations so that we recognize that they are an integral part to our community and thus our organizations, that's a phenomenal step to take, in my opinion.
Sure. Actually, Ricardo and I recorded another podcast. Maybe you remember, Ricardo, that one was in Spanish. So actually, the women live longer, but they arrive to the retirement age with less money, because they usually stop working when they have kids, and that's actually an issue for women as well, right, Ricardo?
Yes, there is a very important issue. One thing is labor force, and the other thing is labor market, and in between is the participation rate. So we are going to need women, older people to participate in the labor market. Otherwise, it's going to be shrinking.
Yeah, that's really like that. So finally, looking ahead and to finish this episode, I wanted to ask you both, how do you see the silver economy shaping the silver economy shaping the global economy over the next decade? Like, what do you think what we're talking here today will have an impact, like in enterprise and the administration, policymakers will start paying attention to this?
I'm not an economist, but certainly I pretend to be from time to time. And undoubtedly, as Ricardo will certainly add to, the economy is in the midst of a very fundamental shift. I'll give you an example. So in Japan in 2024, adult diapers outsold baby diapers.
Oh, I read that. Yeah.
So like that, all of a sudden that's the shock value, right? Of, oh, that was even possible? I didn't know that was possible. And so whether that are healthcare, retirement homes, whether that's anything to do with an aging society, we have to be considerate of the fact that the economy is going to change. And many organizations are still not really pitching, marketing, innovating towards an aging economy. And that's really where I think a pivot's going to happen.
And Ricardo, what do you think?
Definitely, I completely agree. They are going to represent, with decades, half of the population, more than half the size of the economy. So it's a very important part of every country, you know. And you are going to have changes in buildings, because aging in place is going to be important. Leisure, hospitality, asset allocations
everything will be affected.
So let's see what happens.
Let's hope for the best.
Hope for the best.
So thank you both so much for your insight, and thanks to you too, dear listener. So we'll see each other next time in Spanish. Thank you.